History is often written by gleaming swords and mighty kings atop their steeds. But there is a page of history that has been forgotten, a page written not in ink, but in the blood of ultimate loss. Have you ever heard of the gatekeepers? Men who were stripped of the most vital part of their bodies, turned into emotionless tools to serve the lust and power of others. They were the Habshis, the black sons of the Horn of Africa, sold across the ocean, robbed of their ability to be fathers and husbands by the castrating knife. Yet, from that excruciating physical pain, from that defect scorned by the world, they rose. They refused to remain slaves. They refused to be ghosts in the harem. They took up the sword, stepped over the bodies of their enemies, and descended the throne of the mighty Bengal Sultanate. How could a mutilated body rule an entire realm? How could slaves stripped of their dignity become sultans who made all of India bow? Today, we will unveil the secrets of the Habshi dynasty, the eunuchs who proved that power lies not in the body, but in an indomitable will. If you love untold historical stories, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to keep the flame of Black history spreading. Chapter 1. Children of the Wind and Sand. The vast ocean separating the Black continent from the Indian subcontinent has never been a barrier to human greed or the cruel wheels of fate. In the 15th century, as the northeast monsoon winds began to blow across the Indian Ocean, carrying the chill and the billowing sails of Arab merchant ships, a tragic yet magnificent journey began for the sons of Abyssinia, or as we call it today, Ethiopia. This land, with its windy highlands and ancient Christian history, was the cradle of people with extraordinary physique, strong as mountain rock and resilient as ancient roots clinging deep into the arid earth. But ironically, that very strength, that rugged beauty, became the curse that made them the most coveted commodities in the bustling slave markets of the East. Imagine a misty morning in a small village on the shores of the Red Sea, where children are playing and men are preparing for a day of hunting. That peace is suddenly shattered by the sound of hooves, screams, and the chilling clatter of chains. The slavers have arrived. They do not see human beings. They see walking gold. The youngest, strongest men are torn from their families, herded like cattle on long treks across the scorching desert to the seaports. A mother's tears, a father's screams are quickly swallowed by the sand and the wind. It is the beginning of a life that no longer belongs to them. At bustling ports like Zila or Massawa, their fates are decided by finalized prices. But the true tragedy lies not in being sold, but in their destination. In the Islamic world of that time, particularly in Indian kingdoms like Bengal, the demand for absolutely loyal servants in the forbidden palace courts was immense. And loyalty, according to the ruthless concept of the rulers, could only be guaranteed when a man was no longer swayed by lust, no longer burdened by family or offspring. That is why the finest Habshi youths, those with the potential to become the greatest warriors, were selected for a barbaric ritual, castration. The wooden ship creaks as it cuts through the waves, heading east, carrying bleeding bodies and shattered souls. In the dark hold, the smell of the sea mixes with the metallic scent of blood and the stench of despair. They lie there, crowded together, not knowing what tomorrow will bring, not knowing if they will survive their physical wounds. Many died from infection, from blood loss, or simply because they lost the will to live upon realizing they were no longer whole men. Cold bodies were thrown into the sea, food for predators, ending a short, nameless life. But those who survived, those who gritted their teeth through the bone-deep pain, forged an iron will right there in that living hell. They understood that if death had rejected them, they had to live, and live extraordinarily to exact revenge on this cruel fate. When the coast of Bengal appeared in the morning mist, green and fertile, it was not a promised land, but a new arena. Bengal, a land of winding rivers and vast rice fields, was under the rule of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty, a wealthy kingdom, but one rife with conspiracies and treachery. Here, the newly arrived Habshi slaves were given a new name, a new identity. They were no longer the children of freedom from the Ethiopian highlands. They became Habshi guards, attendants, and for those who had undergone the knife, they were called Eunuchs. But history is full of fascinating paradoxes. The very act of stripping away their reproductive ability, of severing their ties to a clan, inadvertently turned them into the most formidable instruments of power. The Sultan of Bengal, Jalaluddin Fath Shah, saw in them absolute safety. He believed that men with no family, no heirs to follow, would never have the ambition to usurp the throne. He believed they would live and die only for their master. It was a fatal mistake. He could not suspect that inside those mutilated bodies were souls, brewing a flame of ambition far greater than that of ordinary men. They had lost the ability to create life, but they learned how to hold the life and death of others in the palm of their hands. From the lowest slaves, they began to infiltrate every corner of power. They learned the language, the courtly mannerisms, how to wield a sword, and how to wield a pen. The innate intelligence of the Ethiopians, combined with the patience of a slave, created true political masters. They became the guardians of the forbidden palace, the only ones allowed to carry weapons near the king, the only ones allowed to enter the harem where the concubines lived. That invisible power gradually accumulated like small drops filling a cup, waiting only for a gentle breeze to spill over and drown everything. The children of the wind and sand were now standing at the threshold of history, ready to rewrite the destiny of an empire with their own one-shackled hands. To understand the rise of the Habshi in Bengal, one must first confront the silence, the terrifying, absolute silence that follows the scream. The journey from the highlands of Ethiopia to the fertile delta of the Ganges was not merely a geographical displacement. It was a fundamental deconstruction of the self. Upon arriving at the slave markets, whether in the bustling ports of the Red Sea or the humid docks of Chittagong, the most promising young men faced a crossroads that would define the rest of their existence. For those chosen to serve in the inner sanctums of power, the path led not to the barracks, but to the surgeon's table. This was the knife of destiny, a cold, sharp edge that severed not just flesh, but the very possibility of a future written in bloodlines and descendants. The procedure itself was a gamble with death, a brutal calculation made by slave masters who viewed these human lives as mere investments. History tells us that the mortality rate for total castration was horrific. Often, only 1 in 3 would survive the trauma, the blood loss, and the inevitable infections that festered in the pre-modern world. Those who died were discarded as failed ventures. Their bodies returned to the dust without ceremony. But those who survived did so by summoning a resilience that bordered on the supernatural. As they lay in recovery, often buried in sand to stem the bleeding or treated with agonizing cauterization, something within them shifted irrevocably. The boy who lay down on that table died there, and the creature who rose was something else entirely, a being existing in the liminal space between genders, outside the natural order of biological imperatives. As the physical wounds healed, leaving behind the smooth, hairless scars that would mark them forever, a different kind of scar tissue formed around their psyches. In the eyes of the society that purchased them, they were now safe. They were viewed as incomplete men, stripped of the aggression and distraction of sexual desire, and thus, paradoxically, they became the most trusted vessels for the secrets of the empire. This is the great irony of the eunuch's existence. By taking everything from them, the ruling elite believed they had created the perfect servant, a blank slate upon which only the master's will could be written. They did not realize that by hollowing out a man, they created a void that demanded to be filled. And if that void could not be filled with love, family, or children, it would be filled with something far more volatile, a cold, calculating hunger for control. Upon their integration into the Bengal Sultanate, these Habshi survivors found themselves thrust into a world of blinding opulence and dizzying complexity, the architecture of Gaur and Pandua, with its intricate terracotta mosques and sprawling palaces, was a far cry from the rugged landscapes of their birth. Here, the air was thick with the scent of spices, humidity, and political intrigue. The Habshi eunuchs, with their dark skin and imposing stature, stood in stark contrast to the local Bengali population and the Persian nobility. They were aliens in every sense, foreign by race, foreign by religion initially, and foreign by their altered biology. Yet, it was precisely this otherness that accelerated their ascent, because they had no kin to favor, no tribal loyalties to the local aristocracy. The sultans pulled them close, wrapping them around the throne like a living shield. They were given the title of Khwajasara or Khoja, positions that granted them access to the one place forbidden to all other men, the harem. The harem was not merely a residence for women. It was the hidden engine of the state. It's the place where alliances were forged in whispers and where the future heirs of the empire were nurtured. To hold the keys to the harem was to hold the keys to the sultan's legacy. The Habshi eunuchs became the guardians of the royal bloodline, the silent sentinels standing at the doors of the private chambers. They saw the sultan not as a god king on a pedestal, but as a man vulnerable, sleeping, eating, arguing, and fearing. They witnessed the fragility of power up close, while the generals on the borders fought for land. The eunuchs in the palace fought for the sultan's ear. This proximity to the divine center of power began to transform the Habshi consciousness. They realized that while they were technically slaves, they possessed a freedom that the nobles did not. A noble had to worry about his lands, his sons, his reputation, and the jealousies of his rivals. A eunuch had nothing to lose but his life, and having already survived the knife, death held less terror for him. They began to organize, forming a brotherhood bound not by blood, but by shared trauma and shared ambition. They adopted the culture, converted to Islam with fervor, and mastered the courtly Persian tongue. Yet, they never forgot the bond of the diaspora. They were distinct, a coarse elite that moved silently through the corridors of power. Their soft footsteps on the marble floors belied the heaviness of their influence. Under the reign of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty, the reliance on these Abyssinians grew to dangerous levels. The sultans, fearful of the indigenous nobility and the encroaching power of rival kingdoms, courted more and more Habshis, promoting them to high ranks within the army and the palace administration. The distinct barrier between the domestic slave and the military commander began to blur. The hand that held the fan to cool the king's brow was now also the hand that held the sword to guard his gate. It was a subtle shift, like the slow turning of the tide, unnoticed until the water was already at the neck. The Habshis were no longer content to be the furniture of the palace. They were becoming its architects, but the knife of destiny cuts both ways. While it severed their link to the future, it sharpened their focus on the present. Without the distraction of a biological legacy, their ego became their child, and power became their lover. They watched the decadent sultans, men born into privilege who took their authority for granted, and they felt a rising contempt. Why should the strong serve the weak? Why should those who have endured the fires of hell bow to those who have never known a day of suffering? In the shadows of the torchlit corridors, glances were exchanged, unspoken agreements were made. The guardian was slowly evolving into the usurper. The knight that had once taken their manhood was about to be turned against the very throat of the empire that wielded it. The stage was set, not for a rebellion of the oppressed masses, but for a coup of the palace insiders, the silent, castrated men who would realize that if they could not be men, they would be kings. To step into the harem of the Bengal Sultanate was to step into a labyrinth of silk and steel, a place where the air hung heavy with the scent of jasmine and the metallic temps of suppressed ambition. For the outside world, this was a forbidden paradise, a garden of earthly delights reserved solely for the pleasure of the monarch. But for the Habshi eunuchs who stood guard at its heavy-ticked doors, the harem was something far more complex and far more dangerous. It was the beating heart of the empire's politics, a gilded cage where the most ruthless battles were fought, not with swords, but with whispers, poisons, and the dark arts of psychological manipulation. And in this shadowed world, the Habshi were not merely observers. They were the masters of the unseen. The architecture of the palace was designed to isolate the Sultan, to elevate him above the common fray of humanity. But in doing so, it made him a prisoner of his own sanctity. The only bridge between the ruler's private chambers and the chaotic reality of the outside world was the course of eunuchs. This unique positioning granted the Habshis a power that was terrifying in its subtlety. They were the filters through which information passed. A plea from a minister, a report from a general, a secret letter from a rival queen, everything to pass through the hands of the dark-skinned guardians before it reached the eyes of the king. They became the gatekeepers of truth itself. By deciding what the Sultan heard and what he did not, they began to shape his reality, slowly painting a picture of the world that served their own rising interests. Inside the women's quarters, the Habshi presence was a paradox. To the hundreds of concubines, wives, and female attendants, these men were neutral entities. Because they had been stripped of their manhood, they were often treated as if they were invisible, mere furniture in the room. This was a fatal underestimation. The women would speak freely in front of them, plotting against one another, confessing their fears, and revealing the deepest weaknesses of the Sultan. They did not realize that the silent statue standing in the corner, his face impassive as stone, was absorbing every word, every inflection, every secret. The Habshis became the repositories of the dynasty's darkest truths. They knew which son was actually the Sultan's favorite. They knew which wife was funding a rebellion. And they knew the precise moment when the king's health began to fail. In this suffocating atmosphere of distrust, the Sultan found a strange, distorted comfort in his Ethiopian guards, surrounded by ambitious nobles who wanted his land and relatives who wanted his crown. The king looked at the Habshis and saw the only people who seemingly had no stake in the game of lineage. He confided in them. He wept before them. He allowed them to see him in his most vulnerable states, sick, fearful, and human. The Habshis saw the man behind the myth. They saw that the shadow of God on earth was often just a trembling creature, paralyzed by indecision and dependent on their strength to even stand upright. This intimacy bred a dangerous familiarity. When a slave sees his master bleed, the master ceases to be a god. The awe evaporates, replaced by a calculating assessment of worth. Life within the harem also forged a steely discipline among the Habshi ranks, unlike the chaotic battlefields where they might have fought as regular soldiers. The harem demanded a war of intellect and patience. One wrong look, one misplaced word could lead to execution. They learned to control their facial expressions with the precision of actors. They learned to move without sound, appearing and disappearing like smoke. This environment honed their political instincts to a razor's edge. They learned that power in Bengal did not reside in the public Durbar hall where the ministers shouted. It resided here, in the quiet corridors where the Sultan sought refuge. They realized that he controls the king's sleep, controls the king's waking hours. As the years of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty dragged on, the decadence of the court grew. The sultans became more withdrawn, more obsessed with pleasure, leaving the heavy lifting of governance to their subordinates. The vacuum of leadership in the heart of the palace was palpable. Nature abhors a vacuum, and power is like water, it flows to where there is space. The Habshis, standing tall and disciplined amidst the rotting grandeur of the court, began to feel the weight of their own potential. They looked at the soft, pampered bodies of the hereditary aristocracy and felt a growing disgust. They, the survivors of the desert and the knife, were the ones holding the roof up. Why should they continue to hold it up for men who did not deserve it? The shadows of the harem were lengthening. The palace guard was no longer just a defensive force. It was becoming a political entity with its own will. The whispers in the corridors changed tone. The Habshis began to meet in secret, not to discuss their duties, but to discuss the state of the realm. They recognized that the Sultan was merely a passenger on the ship of state, and they were the ones manning the sails. The realization was intoxicating. The transition from servant to master begins in the mind long before the first blow is struck. In the silence of the harem, under the flickering light of oil lamps, the eyes of the Habshi eunuchs met, and in that exchange, a silent covenant was formed. They would no longer be the shadows on the wall. They would become the darkness that swallows the room whole. The era of servitude was ending. The era of the kingmakers was about to begin. If the harem was the soul of the Bengal Sultanate, the military was its clenched fist, and under the reign of Sultan Jalaluddin Fath Shah, that fist began to turn black. The Sultan, a man of intellect, but plagued by the eternal paranoia that haunts all absolute rulers, found himself standing on a precipice. He looked out at his court and saw not loyal subjects, but a pack of wolves waiting for him to stumble. The indigenous nobility, the Turkish aristocrats, the Afghan warlords were all entrenched in their own webs of power, their loyalty as shifting as the river sands. To counter them, the Sultan needed a force that existed outside this tangled hierarchy, a force that owed its existence solely to him. And so, he made the decision that would seal the fate of his dynasty. He opened the armory to the Habshis. It was a move born of desperation and calculated logic. In the Sultan's mind, the Habshis were perfect soldiers. They were foreigners with no ancestral lands to defend, no tribal feuds to distract them, and as eunuchs or marginalized slaves, they had no descendants to inherit stolen kingdoms. He believed they would be the silent sentinels, unquestioning, unbreaking, and eternally grateful. He began to promote them aggressively, moving them from the domestic sphere of the palace into the highest ranks of the military command. Suddenly, the men who had once silently poured wine were now donning chainmail and strapping scimitars to their waists. The royal guard, the Pakes, was swelled with thousands of Abyssinian warriors, creating a formidable Praetorian guard that encircled the capital of Gower like a ring of iron. This transformation was profound. When a man holds a broom, he looks down at the floor. When he holds a sword, he looks up at the horizon. The Habshis, now commanders of garrisons and captains of the guard, began to carry themselves with a new gravity, stood drilled with a ferocity that terrified the local populace. Their dark skin, once a mark of servitude, became a badge of elite status. They rode through the streets of Bengal not as shadows, but as the visible manifestation of the Sultan's wrath. The local nobility watched this rise with a mixture of contempt and terror. To them, it was an abomination, slaves dressing like kings, barbarians commanding the faithful. But they dared not speak, for the Habshi blades were sharp, and the Sultan's favor was absolute. However, the Sultan failed to understand the psychology of the soldier. A weapon does not care who wields it. It only cares that it is used. By consolidating so much military power in the hands of a single, cohesive group, Jalaluddin Fath Shah had inadvertently created a state within a state. The Habshi commanders began to realize the extent of their leverage. They were the ones guarding the gates. They were the ones controlling the flow of food and supplies. They were the ones who stood between the king and the assassin's dagger. They looked at the Sultanate man who grew more erratic and demanding by the day, and they began to wonder, if we are the ones who keep him on the throne, why are we not the ones sitting on it? The loyalty of the silent sentinels began to curdle into something else: ownership. They no longer saw themselves as protectors of a divine monarch, but as jailers of a valuable asset. The dynamic of the palace shifted subtly. The Sultan thought he was giving orders, but increasingly, his orders were only carried out if they aligned with the interests of the Habshi clique. A silent coup was taking place, not with bloodshed, but with the slow, suffocating tightening of the grip. The sentinels were still standing at their posts, their faces impassive, their eyes forward. But their hearts had turned. They were no longer watching for enemies from the outside. They were assessing the weakness on the inside. This was the era of the palace guard phenomenon. A story repeated throughout history, from Rome to Baghdad, and now to Bengal. The protectors realized that the entity they protected was fragile while they were strong. The Habshi soldiers, bonded by the trauma of their past and the camaraderie of the barracks, forged a brotherhood that was far stronger than their allegiance to any abstract crown. They saw the corruption of the court, the weakness of the heirs, and the decay of the administration. In their eyes, they were the only pure element left in the empire, pure steel, untainted by the soft vices of a nobility. As the sun set over the massive citadel of Gower, the shadows of the Habshi guards stretched long across the courtyard, swallowing the throne room in darkness. The Sultan slept soundly, believing he was safe behind his wall of black stone. He did not hear the whispers in the barracks. He did not see the knowing glances exchanged between the commanders of the watch. He did not realize that the sentinels had stopped looking outward to defend him, and had started looking inward, measuring the distance between their swords and his neck. The silence of the sentinels was not the silence of peace. It was the hush before the storm. The wall he had built was about to fall, and it would fall inward, crushing the very man who had raised it. Betrayal is rarely a sudden event. It is a slow-growing plant that takes root in the dark soil of resentment, watered by silence and fed by the accumulation of small grievances. By the late 1480s, the atmosphere within the royal citadel of Gower had shifted from one of uneasy truce to palpable hostility. Sultan Jalaluddin Fath Shah, a ruler of intelligence and foresight, finally began to see the terrifying reality of his own creation. He looked at the thousands of Habshi guards surrounding him, men he had armed, men he had elevated, men he had trusted above his own command for the first time. He felt not safety, but suffocation. The ring of iron he had forged to protect his throne had tightened to the point where it was cutting off his own circulation. He realized, perhaps too late, that a king who relies solely on mercenaries becomes a mercenary in his own kingdom, negotiating for his survival every single day. The Sultan attempted to regain control, but his methods were that of a desperate man trying to hold back a landslide with his bare hands. He began to issue decrees to curb the power of the Habshi commanders. He tried to discipline them, to remind them of their station as slaves, however exalted. Reports from the time suggest that Fath Shah grew increasingly severe, punishing the eunuchs for minor infractions, perhaps hoping that fear would re-establish the natural order of master and servant. But fear is a volatile fuel. When applied to weak men, it breaks them. When applied to men who have already survived the ultimate violation of their bodies and spirits, it hardens them. The whip no longer brought obedience. It brought cold, calculating fury. Among the ranks of the Habshis, a leader began to emerge from the shadows. A figure would become the architect of the coming storm. His name was Shahzada, a eunuch of immense ambition and terrifying charisma. He was not merely a soldier. He was a politician who understood the nuances of the court better than the nobles born into it. Shahzada saw the Sultan's attempts to leash them not as legitimate discipline, but as a betrayal of the unwritten contract between them. "We bled for you," the Habshis thought. "We stood guard while you slept. We killed your enemies, and now you seek to discard us like broken tools." The seed of betrayal was planted in this profound sense of injustice. They viewed themselves not as usurpers, but as the wronged party, as victims of an ungrateful master who had forgotten who truly held the keys to the empire. The corridors of the palace began to buzz with the static of conspiracy. Secret meetings were held not in the dark of night, but in the broad daylight of the barracks, under the guise of military drills. The Habshis reached out to the disaffected elements of the court, finding allies among those who had been marginalized by the Sultan's erratic rule. But the core of the plot remained exclusively Abyssinian, It was a racial and fraternal bond that the Sultan could not penetrate. The spies he sent to infiltrate their ranks were either turned or disappeared, their bodies found floating in the moat. The Sultan was going blind. The information network he had relied on, the very eunuchs he had placed in the harem, was now feeding him lies, soothing him into a false sense of security while the knife was being sharpened just inches from his back. What is fascinating about this moment in history is the psychological shift that occurred within the Habshi consciousness. They stopped identifying as outsiders in a foreign land and began to see themselves as the true stakeholders of Bengal. They looked at the Sultan with his lineage and his divine right and saw only incompetence. They looked at themselves with their discipline and their strength and saw the rightful rulers. It was a triumph of meritocracy in its most twisted, violent form. They believed that the right to rule did not come from blood or God, but from the ability to seize and hold power. The divine right of kings was about to clash with the right of the strongest. As the hot, humid summer of 1487 approached, the tension in Gower reached a breaking point. The Sultan, sensing the danger but unable to pinpoint its source, became a prisoner in his own palace. He surrounded himself with a few guards he thought he could trust, but he could not escape the gaze of the Habshis. They were everywhere, pouring his wine, guarding his door, standing silently in the corner of his bedchamber. The betrayal was not coming from an invading army on the horizon. It was standing right next to him, breathing the same air. The seeds had fully matured. The vines of treachery had wrapped themselves around the pillars of the throne, and the fruit was ready to drop. The tragedy of Fat Shah was the tragedy of all tyrants who believed they could own human beings completely. He forgot that even a eunuch, stripped of his manhood, retains his pride. He forgot that a slave who was given a sword eventually asks why he is still a slave. The stage was set for a night of blood that will wash away the Ilyas Shahi dynasty forever. The Habshis were done serving. The time for waiting was over. The silence of the sentinels was about to be broken by the roar of regicide. History rarely records the sound of a dynasty dying, but if it did, it would sound like the hushed footsteps of bare feet on cold marble. The night of the coup in 1487 was not marked by the thunder of cannons or the clash of armies on a dusty plain. It was a night of suffocating stillness, where the only thing louder than the chirping of crickets was the pounding heart of treason. The palace of Gower, a sprawling complex of shadows and secrets, slept under a heavy blanket of humidity. Sultan Jalaluddin Fath Shah, the last legitimate heir of a glorious bloodline, retired to his chambers, believing that the thick walls and the formidable guards outside his door secured his safety. He did not know that the danger was not outside the door. It was standing right beside it, holding a lantern to light the way for death. The leader of the conspiracy, the eunuch commander Shahzada, moved with the precision of a predator that had stalked its prey for a lifetime. There was no hesitation in his steps, only the cold, mechanical resolve of a man who had accepted his damnation. The Habshi guards, the silent sentinels who had stood watch for years, now turned their weapons inward. They silently neutralized the few loyalists remaining in the palace's slit-throat hair. Muffled cry, they're clearing the path to the royal bedchamber. It was a surgical operation, a testament to the terrifying discipline of the Abyssinian course. They moved like ghosts through the corridors. They knew better than anyone else, their dark skin blending into the shadows, their eyes fixed on the ultimate prize. When Shahzada entered the Sultan's private quarters, the air changed. The sanctity of the monarch, a barrier that had held for centuries, evaporated in an instant. The Sultan, perhaps awakened by a sound or a sudden shift in the atmosphere, looked up to see his most trusted servant standing over him. In that split second, the entire structure of the empire collapsed. The look in Shahzada's eyes was not one of servitude, it was one of judgment. There were no grand speeches, no list of grievances read aloud. The time for words had passed. Peace was the moment where the abstract concept of power met the brutal reality of violence. The assassination was intimate and visceral. It was not a faceless arrow shot from a distance. It was the hands of a servant taking the life of a master as the blade found its mark, or as the hands tightened around the royal throat. Historical accounts whisper of both. The Sultan must have realized the ultimate irony of his fate. He was being unmade by the very creatures he had made. The blood that stained the silk sheets was not just the blood of a man, it was the blood of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty. With every gasping breath of the dying king, a history of over a century was being erased. The shadow of God was extinguished, leaving only a mortal corpse, cooling rapidly in the humid night air. For a moment, silence reclaimed the room. Shahzada stood over the body, his chest heaving, his hands stained with the most forbidden blood in the realm. This was the point of no return. Killing the king, he had killed his own past self. The slave was dead. Dinah was dead. Tina, what remained, was a usurper, a king-killer, a monster in the eyes of the faithful, but a victor in the eyes of history. The other conspirators gathered around, looking at the lifeless body of Fath Shah, not with remorse, but with a terrifying sense of liberation. They had done the unthinkable. They had proven that the Sultan was not divine. He was meat and bone, just like them. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in deception. The Habshis did not run. They did not panic, okay? They controlled the narrative instantly. The palace gates remained locked. The morning call to prayer rang out as usual, masking the horror that lay within. Shahzada and his inner circle moved quickly to consolidate their hold, securing the treasury and the armory. They knew that when the sun rose, they would have to face the court, the army, and the people. But for the remaining hours of that dark night, they were the masters of a secret world. They washed the blood from their hands, but they could never wash it from their souls. They had crossed a threshold that few men ever dared to approach. As dawn broke over Bengal, painting the sky in hues of violent orange and red, it reflected the reality on the ground. The guards on the walls looked the same, the flags flew the same, but the heart of the empire had been transplanted. Okay, the night of blood was over, but the reign of the eunuchs had just begun. The people of Gaur woke up to a world that looked familiar, unaware that the natural order had been inverted. The servants were now the masters, and the mutilated, castrated guardians were about to step out of the shadows and sit upon the throne of the tiger. Have you ever heard of a king who wasn't born into royalty, but bought as a slave? What if I told you one of the most powerful rulers in Indian history was a eunuch who rose from servitude to command an entire empire? This isn't a fantasy novel. It's the incredible, true story of Sultan Barbak Shah of the Jaunpur Sultanate. His story begins not in a palace, but in a slave market. Born in Ethiopia, he was brought to India and, due to his intelligence and sharp mind, eventually came into the service of the Sharki dynasty. Here, under his master, he was known as Barbak. He wasn't just any servant. He was ambitious, clever, and a master of political maneuvering. He learned the language of power, not from books, but from watching it unfold in the royal court. As the Sharki dynasty began to weaken, Barbak saw his chance. The internal conflicts and weak leadership created a power vacuum, and he was perfectly positioned to fill it. Through a combination of cunning strategy, building alliances with key military commanders, showcasing his own formidable leadership skills, he staged a coup. He overthrew the last legitimate ruler of the dynasty and declared himself Sultan, taking the name Barbak Shah. Imagine the shockwaves this sent through the region. A former slave, a eunuch, now sat on the throne of a powerful kingdom. Many nobles and neighboring rulers refused to accept his authority. But Barbak Shah was more than just an ambitious courtier. He was a surprisingly effective ruler. He understood that to maintain power, he needed a strong army and a loyal following. He recruited thousands of Abyssinian soldiers known as Habshis, who were fiercely loyal to him. This formidable army became the backbone of his rule, allowing him to crush rebellions and defend his borders. He wasn't just a warrior, though. He was also a patron of the arts and architecture, continuing the Sharqi legacy of building beautiful mosques, tombs, and palaces that blended Persian and Indian styles. Jaunpur, under his rule, continued to be a vibrant center of culture and learning. However, the very foundation of his power would also lead to his downfall. His heavy reliance on the Habshi soldiers created resentment among the native Indian nobility and the general populace. They saw these foreign-born soldiers as arrogant and overbearing. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness. That moment came when Barbak Shah's reign was challenged by Bali Lodi, the powerful Sultan of Delhi. The ensuing conflict drained Jaunpur's resources and weakened Barbak's grip on power. Seeing their opportunity, the resentful local nobles, led by a figure named Jamal Khan, rose up in a massive rebellion. Betrayed from within and pressed by enemies from without, Barbak Shah's reign came to a violent end. He was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, and his kingdom was thrown into chaos. The Habshi soldiers he had trusted were either killed or driven out, and the Jaunpur Sultanate was soon absorbed by the expanding Lodi dynasty. Sultan Barbak Shah's rule was brief, lasting only a few years, but his story is a powerful testament to ambition, power, and the complex dynamics of medieval Indian politics. He was a man who broke every rule to seize a crown, a eunuch slave who became a king, only to be consumed by the very forces he unleashed. His rise was meteoric, and his fall was just as dramatic. Thanks for watching. If you found this slice of history fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more incredible stories from the past. See you next time. There is an old adage in the halls of power. You can build a throne with bayonets, but you cannot sit on them for long. Sultan Barbak Shah, the eunuch, formerly known as Shahzada, discovered the bitter truth of this wisdom almost immediately. The euphoria of the coup, the adrenaline of the assassination, and the grim satisfaction of seeing the nobles bawl of it evaporated within days, replaced by a cold, gnawing dread. Seizing power is an act of force. Holding power is an act of legitimacy, and legitimacy was the one thing Barbak Shah could not steal, could not invent, and could not buy. He was a king without a past, and, tragically, a king without a future. His reign was destined to be a flash in the pan, a violent spasm in the history of Bengal that lasted only a few short months. But in those months, the kingdom held its breath. Barbak Shah ruled not as a statesman, but as a prisoner of his own paranoia. He knew that outside the heavy wooden doors of the palace, the people whispered. He knew the religious scholars debated the legality of his rule. He knew the dispossessed nobles were sharpening their knives in the provinces. To silence the whispers, he chose the only tool a usurper understands: terror. The palace became a slaughterhouse for anyone suspected of loyalty to the old dynasty. Anyone who dared to look at the Sultan with anything less than abject worship was purged. The rivers of Gower ran red, not with the blood of foreign invaders, but with the blood of the city's own elite. This tyranny was not born of sadistic madness, but of a profound existential insecurity. A complete king relies on the loyalty of his children and his kin to secure his legacy. Barbak Shah had no children. He had no kin. He was a biological dead end. This sterility created a terrifying vacuum in his governance. He had no reason to build for tomorrow. He only cared about surviving today. His policies were erratic, short-sighted, and predatory. He looted the treasury to pay his Praetorian Guard, buying loyalty with gold because he could not command it with love. He surrounded himself with sycophants who fed his delusions, creating an echo chamber where he was the greatest monarch on earth. Outside, the pillars of the state were crumbling. However, the greatest threat to Barbak Shah did not come from the Bengali people, nor from the old nobility. It came from within the brotherhood of the Habshis itself. The very men who had helped him seize the throne began to look at their leader with growing unease. They had rebelled to gain respect, to gain power, to prove their worth. But Barbak Shah's disastrous rule was proving the opposite. It was confirming every prejudice the world held against him. He was making them look like savages, not rulers. The discipline that had defined the Habshi corps was dissolving into chaos. The other commanders, men of ability and foresight, realized that if they continued to follow this paranoid king, they would all be dragged down into the abyss with him. The atmosphere in the court became suffocating. The Sultan trusted no one. He saw assassins in the shadows of the curtains. He tasted poison in every cup of wine. He stopped sleeping. His eyes, rimmed with dark circles, darted frantically around the Durbar hall. He was the most powerful man in Bengal, yet he was the most trapped. He had locked himself in a cage of gold and swallowed the key. The tragic irony of his life reached its zenith. He had escaped the slavery of men, only to become a slave to fear. As the weeks turned into months, the inevitable end approached. The castrated king had proven that a mutilated body could seize an empire. It failed to prove that it could heal a fractured land. The energy of the coup had dissipated, leaving behind a stale, rotting regime. The murmurs of discontent grew into a roar. The other Habshi generals, particularly a man of noble bearing named Malik Andal, began to distance themselves. They saw that the experiment of Barbak Shah was a failure. The knife that had carved his path to the throne was now dull, and a new blade was needed to cut the rot from the body of the state. The reign was short, brutal, so tragic a dark interlude that served as a grim lesson. Power without purpose is merely violence, and violence eventually consumes its creator. In the chaotic theater of history, the line between a hero and a traitor is often drawn not by actions, but by who survives to hold the pen. As the brief, nightmarish reign of Sultan Barbak Shah plunged the Bengal Sultanate into a spiral of paranoia and blood, the eyes of the court turned desperately toward the horizon, searching for a savior. They did not look to a prince of royal blood, for they were all dead or in hiding. They did not look to a foreign emperor, for that meant invasion. Instead, they looked to another Abyssinian, a man cut from the same dark cloth as the tyrant on the throne, yet possessing a soul forged in a completely different fire. His name was Malik Andal, a figure who walks the razor's edge of moral ambiguity, challenging us to ask, is a man who betrays his brother to save a kingdom a saint, or is he merely a more calculating sinner? Malik Andal was everything Barbak Shah was not. If Barbak was the embodiment of the Habshi's resentment and hunger for power, Andal was the embodiment of their loyalty and martial honor. He was the commander of the army, a veteran general who had spent his life on the frontiers, far from the poisoning whispers of the harem, and served the murdered Sultan, Jalaluddin Fath Shah, with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. When the news of the regicide reached him in the distant provinces, it is said that he did not weep. He went silent. The murder of his master by his own countrymen, by his own brothers in Diaspora, was a wound that cut deeper than any sword. It was a stain on the collective honor of the Habshi corps, a violation of the sacred bond between salt giver and salt eater. But the path to justice was paved with necessary lies. Andal knew that to march on Gower with an army would be suicide. The capital was a fortress, and Barbak Shah held the keys. To destroy the monster, he had to enter the belly of the beast, and so Malik Andal played the most dangerous game of his life. He returned to the capital, not as an avenger, but as a submissive subject. He walked into the Durbar hall, bowed before the usurper, Barbak Shah, the man who had murdered his king, and pledged his allegiance. Imagine the psychological torture of that moment. To kiss the hand that is dripping with the blood of your beloved master requires a discipline that is almost inhuman. Barbak Shah, desperate for validation from the military elite. Embraced Andel, believing that racial solidarity trumped political morality. He saw a fellow Habshi. He did not see the dagger hidden behind the smile. It was in the shadows of the palace, away from the prying eyes of the new sultan, that the true drama unfolded. The widowed queen of Fath Shah, living in a state of terrified captivity, reached out to Andal. The meeting between the African general and the Bengali queen is one of the most poignant scenes in this saga. Here was the grieving mother of the nation, begging a former slave, a man of the same race as her husband's killer, to be the instrument of justice. She appealed to his honor, to the memory of the man who had raised him up. This interaction highlights the complex, fluid nature of power in medieval Bengal. The racial lines blurred. It was no longer about black versus brown, but about legitimacy versus tyranny. Andal was forced to choose. To side with Barbuk was to choose his people, but betray his conscience. To side with the queen was to betray his brother, but save his soul. Malik Andal made his choice. He chose the path of the righteous traitor. He began to weave a counter-conspiracy within the very heart of the palace. He carefully selected men who were loyal to him personally, rather than to the crown or the Habshi faction as a whole. This required a level of secrecy that makes modern espionage look clumsy. He had to laugh at the usurper's jokes, drink his wine, and endure his erratic rants, all while mentally mapping out the geometry of the assassination. He was a ghost in the machine, slowly dismantling the regime from the inside out. But history asks us to scrutinize his motives. Was Malik Andal truly just a loyal servant seeking to avenge his master? Or was he, too, seduced by the vacuum of power? Did he look at the incompetence of Barbuk Shah and realize that he could be the sultan that Barbuk failed to be? The hero narrative paints him as a selfless guardian, a dark knight protecting the realm. The traitor narrative paints him as an opportunist who used the moral high ground as a ladder to climb onto the throne himself. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps in the brutal Game of Thrones, one cannot be a hero without being a traitor to someone. As the conspiracy ripened, the tension in the palace became electric. Barbuk Shah, sensing the shifting tides but unable to see the source, grew even more unstable. The tragedy of the situation is palpable. Instead, they were enemies. The story of Malik Andal is a testament to the fact that the black experience in history is not a monolith. Malik Andal, the trusted general, the sworn friend, had the weapon ready. He had the motive. He had the opportunity. The question of whether history would remember him as the savior of Bengal or the second usurper hung heavy in the humid air, waiting for the stroke of the blade to decide the answer. The night chosen for the final act of this tragic opera was one of suffocating darkness, a moonless void that seemed to swallow the royal citadel of Gower whole. It was as if the heavens themselves had closed their eyes, refusing to witness the fratricide that was about to unfold. Malik Andal, the man who carried the weight of a kingdom's hope and a brother's betrayal, moved towards the Sultan's private chambers. He was not alone. A select group of conspirators, men whose loyalty had been bought with blood oaths, moved with him. They were shadows within shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpets, their breathing shallow and controlled. The palace, usually a hive of activity, had fallen into an eerie silence, a manufactured stillness that served as the prelude to chaos. Inside the royal bedchamber, Sultan Barbuk Shah lay in a state of restless slumber. His short reign had been a fever dream of paranoia, and even in sleep, his hand never strayed far from the dagger beneath his pillow. He was a man hunted by his own reflection, aware that the unnatural way he had seized the throne demanded an unnatural end. When the doors burst open, not with a formal announcement, but with the violent crash of wood splintering, the Sultan awoke instantly. But it was not the awakening of a king. It was the awakening of a cornered animal. The lamps were extinguished in the initial scuffle, deliberate tactic, or a chaotic accident of the freight plunging the room into absolute darkness. What followed was a scene of macabre intimacy. In the pitch black, stripped of visual cues, the battle became primal. It was a sound of heavy breathing, the scent of sweat and fear, and the desperate grappling of bodies. It was Habshi against Habshi. The shared history of their diaspora, the shared trauma of the Middle Passage, the shared scars of the castration nightfall of it, was forgotten in the frenzied struggle for survival. Malik Andal, a warrior of renown, found himself wrestling with the man he had once called a brother. In the darkness, there were no ranks, no titles, only the raw will to live. Historical chronicles whisper of a chaotic melee, of the Sultan shouting for guards who would never come, and of the conspirators striking blindly, terrified that they might kill one another in the confusion. When the final blow landed a strike that severed the tether between the usurper and his stolen life, the silence, the rush back into the room, was heavier than lead. A torch was relit, the flickering flame revealing the grim tableau. Sultan Barbak Shah, the eunuch king, lay dead. His eyes, wide open, stared up at the ceiling, perhaps freezing the final realization of betrayal. Malik Andal stood over him, his chest heaving, his weapon dripping. There was no cheer of victory. There was only the crushing weight of what had been done. To kill a tyrant is a political act. To kill a kinsman is a spiritual wound. Andal had saved the kingdom, but in doing so, he had severed a part of his own soul. But the death of the Sultan was only the beginning of the night's work. Coup is like a hydra. Cutting off the head does not kill the beast if the body remains active. The internal purge had begun. The palace exploded into violence. The loyalists of Barbak Sapshus, who had tied their fortunes to the usurper and had participated in his reign of terror, realized, too late, that the tide had turned. They were hunted down in the corridors, in the barracks, and in the courtyards. It was a civil war fought within the confines of a single building. Brother turned against brother. Men who had messed together, who had prayed together, now drove steel into each other's hearts. This purge was not merely political. It was a desperate attempt to cleanse the stain of the previous regime. Malik Andal knew that for his rule, or the rule of whomever he chose to survive, the cancer of Barbak's tyranny had to be excised completely. The fighting was brutal in close quarters. The marble floors of the palace, once polished to a mirror shine, became slick with blood. The screams of the dying echoed off the stone walls, mixing with the morning call to prayer, creating a dissonance that haunted the survivors for years. It was the darkest hour of the Habshi presence in Bengal, a moment where their unity, their greatest strength, was shattered by the corrupting influence of absolute power. As the sun rose, the magnitude of the purge became visible. The bodies of the slain were quietly removed. The blood was washed away. But the atmosphere of the court had changed irrevocably. The Habshi community was fractured. Survivors looked at one another with suspicion. Who had stood with Barbak? Who had stood with Andal? Who had hesitated? The trust that had bound them together as strangers in a strange land was gone, replaced by a cold, transactional loyalty. The Guardians had decimated their own ranks. Malik Andal emerged from the carnage as the undisputed master of the citadel, but he was a man transformed. He had walked into the fire and returned, but he carried the smell of smoke and death. He gathered the surviving nobles and the remaining Habshi commanders in the Durbar Hall. The throne sat empty, a gaping maw that had consumed 2 kings in as many years. The air was thick with expectation. The nobles, terrified and exhausted, looked to Andal. They saw a man who had restored order, but they also saw a man capable of ruthless violence. The question hung in the air. Would he follow the path of Barbak and seize the crown for himself? Or would he step back into the shadows? The internal purge had cleared the board, removing the pieces that cluttered the game. But now, the board was empty, and the game had to begin anew. Malik Andal stood at the foot of the throne, looking up at the seat of power. It was no longer just a chair. It was an altar, requiring constant sacrifice. He had sacrificed his brother to reach it. Now, the empire waited to see if he would offer himself up to the beast of sovereignty. The hero had survived the night, but could the king survive the day? The knife had done its work. Now, the burden of rebuilding a shattered world fell upon shoulders that were weary from the slaughter. When the smoke cleared from the internal purge and the last echoes of the fratricidal strife faded into the stone walls of the citadel, a strange silence descended upon Gower. It was not the fearful silence of the grave that had characterized the reign of Barbarak Shah, but the expectant silence of a field after a storm, waiting for the first ray of sun. The nobility of Bengal, exhausted by years of tyranny and bloodshed, looked toward the empty throne with trepidation. They feared another monster. What they got instead was a monarch who would be remembered as one of the most just and noble rulers to ever wear the crown of Bengal. Malik Andel ascended the steps, not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the solemn weight of duty. He took the regnal title Saifuddin Firuz Shah, and with his coronation, the Habshi interregnum transformed from a nightmare into a brief, shining dream. The reign of Saifuddin Firuz Shah serves as a powerful counter-narrative to the prejudice that has plagued the history of the African diaspora in India, where his predecessor was a symbol of chaos and illegitimate ambition. Firuz Shah became the embodiment of order, piety, and benevolence. It is a historical irony of the highest order. The outsider, the man brought to these shores in chains, came the one to teach the indigenous nobility the true meaning of kingship. He understood that power is not a possession to be hoarded, but a trust to be administered. He opened the treasury not to buy silence, but to feed the poor. He dispensed justice not to instill terror, but to restore balance. For the common people of Bengal, the farmers in the delta, the weavers in the villages, the color of the sultan's skin mattered far less than the content of his character. And in Firuz Shah, they found a protector. This era, often referred to as the golden age of the Habshi rule, was marked by a renaissance of culture and architecture. The Sultan, perhaps aware that his lineage would not survive him, sought to leave a legacy in stone. The most enduring symbol of this ambition is the Firuz Minor, a towering monument that still pierces the sky of Gower today. Standing over 25 meters tall, this architectural marvel is not merely a tower. It is a declaration of identity. Its intricate terracotta work and imposing structure blend the indigenous Bengali style with the martial strength of the Abyssinian spirit. When you look at the Firuz Minor, you are not just seeing bricks and mortar. You're seeing the crystallized will of a former slave who wished to say to eternity, "We were here, we built, we ruled." It stands as a defiant finger pointing towards the heavens, challenging the notion that the Habshi were mere destructors of history. Under Firuz Shah, the administrative machinery of the state began to hum with efficiency again. He managed to tame the unruly Habshi soldiers, integrating them into a disciplined force that protected the borders rather than terrorizing the capital. He balanced the competing factions of the court, the Turks, the Afghans, and the Bengalis with a diplomatic finesse that belied his military background. It was a delicate dance. He was a Habshi, ruling over a population that was not his own, yet he garnered a respect that bordered on reverence. Legends from the time speak of his personal generosity, of how he would weep at the plight of the destitute king, and how he would personally inspect the markets to ensure fair prices. This was the good king archetype brought to life by a man whom the world had tried to discard. However, a golden age in a turbulent time is like a beautiful sunset, breathtaking, but inevitably fleeting. The tragedy of Saifuddin Firuz Shah's reign lay in its singularity. He was an exception, a glorious anomaly. He proved that a Habshi could rule with wisdom, but he could not erase the systemic instability that the coup had introduced. He was a man of peace, sitting on a throne, forged in blood. While he ruled, the wolves were kept at bay by the sheer force of his personality. But in the shadows, the old prejudices lingered. The nobility bowed to him, yes, but they still whispered. They still saw him as a temporary custodian, an interlude before the rightful order could be restored. Furthermore, the burden of being the good one is a heavy cross to bear. Firuz Shah had to be perfect. He could not afford a single mistake, a single moment of weakness. He was carrying the reputation of his entire race on his shoulders. Every act of justice was a defense of his people's humanity. Every act of charity was a rebuttal to the stereotype of the barbaric African. It was a performance of high stakes, played out every single day in the Durbar Hall. He gave Bengal 3 years of peace. 3 years where the sword slept in the scabbard and the fields were harvested in safety. In the grand sweep of history, 3 years is a blink of an eye. But for the people who lived through it, it was an eternity of relief. As the year 1489 approached, the golden light began to fade. The Sultan, beloved by the people but envied by the ambitious, was aging. The wolves who had been waiting in the dark began to circle closer. They knew that the strength of the regime was tied entirely to the life of one man. When that light was extinguished, the darkness would return, perhaps thicker and more suffocating than before. The Golden Age was not a new dawn. It was the final, brilliant flare of a candle before it gutters out. Saifuddin Firuz Shah had shown the world what the Habshis were capable of creating, but he could not protect his creation from the inevitable entropy of power. The builder had laid his stones, but the destroyers were already gathering their hammers. When a great tree falls in the forest, the earth shakes, but it is the silence that follows which is truly terrifying. The death of Saifuddin Firuz Shah marked the end of the brief, luminous interlude where righteousness held the sword of state. Whether he died by the gentle hand of age or the quiet poison of a rival history remains deliberately vague. His departure toward the veil of stability. The bell had covered the Bengal Sultanate. The good king was gone, and in his place, the ghost of power returned to haunt the corridors of Gaur. This ghost was not a spirit of the dead, but a malevolent energy of the living raw, unbridled ambition that had been kept in check by Firuz Shah's moral authority. Now, unleashed, it sought a new vessel, and it found one in the darkest corners of the Habshi heart. The immediate aftermath of the Golden Age was a descent into a grotesque parody of governance. The throne passed momentarily to the infant son of the late Sultan, a child named Mahmud Shah II. But in the brutal calculus of the Habshi court, a child was not a king, he was a pawn. The regency was seized by a figure named Habshi Khan, a man who mistook arrogance for strength. But the true danger lay not in the regent, but in the man watching from the shadows. Sidi Bader. If Firuz Shah was the philosopher king, Sidi Bader was the mad dog of war. He represented the ultimate corruption of the diaspora's survival instinct. He did not want to rule to build. He wanted to rule to possess. The transition was swift and bloody. Sidi Bader, driven by a hunger that no amount of gold could satiate, first eliminated the regent, Habshi Khan, in a display of ruthless efficiency. Then he turned his eyes to the child king. The murder of the young Mahmud Shah is one of the darkest stains on the Habshi legacy in India. It was a line that even the hardened soldiers of the time hesitated to cross, the killing of an innocent, a boy who carried the blood of the beloved Firuz Shah. But Sidi Bader did not hesitate, stepped over the small corpse to climb the steps of the throne, proclaiming himself Sultan Shamsuddin Muzaffar Shah. With that act, the ghost of power had fully possessed him, turning the palace once again into a slaughterhouse. The reign of Shamsuddin Muzaffar Shah was a study in tyranny. He knew he was hated. He knew the nobility viewed him as a usurper of the worst kind of servant who had murdered his master's son. To counter this, he unleashed a reign of terror that made the earlier days of Barbuk Shah look like a mild disturbance. He raised taxes to extortionate levels, bleeding the peasantry dry to fill his coffers. He suspected treachery in every whisper, leading to a purge of the nobility that was so thorough had threatened to leave the state without any administrators. The ghost had driven him mad. He saw enemies in the reflection of his own sword. Yet, there is a tragic complexity to this mad sultan. Historical accounts suggest he was a brilliant military commander, a man of immense physical strength and tactical acumen. Won battles, he crushed rebellions, and he expanded the borders, but he could not win the war against his own insecurity. He built his authority on the pillars of fear, forgetting that fear is a brittle foundation. The Habshi army, once the disciplined pride of the state, degenerated into a band of enforcers, hated by the common people they were supposed to protect. The racial divide, which Firuz Shah had worked so hard to bridge, was ripped open again. Abyssinian became synonymous with the tyrant. As the years of his harsh rule dragged on, the palace of Gaur became a claustrophobic prison. The sultan stopped trusting even his fellow Habshis. He realized that the very mechanism that brought him to power, the coup, the betrayal, the knife in the dark, was now the greatest threat to his own life. He was trapped in the cycle he had helped create. The ghost of power whispered to him that he was invincible, while simultaneously showing him the inevitability of his doom. He hoarded wealth as if gold could build a wall high enough to keep out death. He surrounded himself with thousands of guards, yet he was the loneliest man in the empire. This era teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of illegitimacy. When power is seized without moral grounding, it consumes the holder. Sfazat Muzaffar Shah was a victim of his own success. He had survived the Middle Passage, the castration, and the brutal politics of the court to reach the pinnacle of the world. But at the top, he found nothing but thin air and the vertigo of imminent fall. The nobility, the clergy, and the people had reached their breaking point. The ghost had fed enough on the blood of Bengal. The atmosphere was heavy with the static of a coming storm that would not just remove a king, but would wash the Habshis out of history. The ghost of power had claimed its final victim, and now the land itself was preparing to vomit out the poison. The soil of Bengal has a memory. It remembers the scent of rain on dry earth, the weight of a farmer's plow, and the taste of blood spilled by conquerors. For centuries, it has endured, silently watching empires rise and fall. But even the most patient earth has its breaking point, and by the late 15th century, the tyranny of the Habshi Sultan, Shamsuddin Muzaffar Shah, had pushed Bengal to that very edge. The Habshis, originally Abyssinian slave soldiers, had seized power in a series of bloody coups. Muzaffar Shah was the last and most brutal of their line. He ruled not with justice, but with sheer terror. His taxes crushed the peasantry, and his purges decimated the noble families. He was a wolf pretending to be a shepherd, and the flock was beginning to stir. The land itself, the very soul of Bengal, was preparing to reject the poison in its veins. A storm was gathering, and it was about to break over the capital city of Gaur. The man who would channel this storm was an irony of history, the Sultan's own prime minister. His wazir, a man named Syed Hussein, an Arab by descent, but Bengali in spirit. Hussein was a master strategist. He watched the Sultan's madness with cold, calculating patience. He saw that the Habshi regime, for all its military might, was a tree without roots. It had no connection to the people it ruled, no legitimacy in their eyes. Hussein knew that to topple this brutal regime, he needed more than an army. He needed the moral force of an entire kingdom united against its oppressor. And so, the rebellion began. It wasn't a quiet conspiracy hatched in shadowed halls. It was a roar of defiance that echoed from the villages to the cities. The Bengali nobles, long divided by their own rivalries, set aside their differences and rallied to Hussein's cause. But the true heart of the rebellion was the common people. Farmers, artisans, and merchants, armed with little more than their tools and a burning desire for freedom, swelled the ranks of the rebel army. This wasn't just a grab for power. It was a popular uprising. An entire nation was marching on its capital to reclaim its destiny. They surrounded the massive fortress of Gaur, trapping Muzaffar Shah and his elite Habshi guards inside. What followed was a grueling 4-month siege. It was a clash of two worlds. Inside the stone walls were the isolated professional soldiers, the finest warriors in the land. Outside was the raw, chaotic, and overwhelming power of the Bengali people. It was the fortress against the flood, and the waters were rising. Inside the citadel, panic began to set in. The Habshi guards, who had never known defeat in open battle, found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't strike with a sword: starvation. Day by day, their supplies dwindled. The Sultan, a man of immense physical power, paced his treasury, surrounded by piles of gold and jewels he had plundered from his own people. But he couldn't eat gold. He couldn't drink diamonds. Looking out from the ramparts, he saw not a disciplined army, but a sea of campfires stretching to the horizon. In that moment, he must have realized his reign was over. His brute strength was useless against the collective will of a people who simply wanted him gone. The end came swiftly and brutally. History gives us different accounts. Some say the cunning Said Hussein lured the Sultan out with a false promise of negotiation and had him assassinated. Others claim the despot Sultan led a final suicidal charge out of the gates, but the outcome was the same. The tyrant was dead. The man who had terrorized the kingdom was now just a corpse. With his death, the spell of fear was broken. The thousands of Habshi soldiers, the so-called silent sentinels who had dominated Bengal, were now leaderless, adrift in a land that had become their enemy. The fall of Muzaffar Shah was more than the death of a king. It was the violent expulsion of a foreign body. The gates of Gaur were thrown open, and the rebel forces poured in. The city was cleansed. Spawns of Habshi power were torn down, and the people reclaimed their capital, their palace, and their dignity. The fury of the earth had done its work. Said Hussein, the architect of the rebellion, would soon be crowned as the new Sultan, inaugurating a new golden age for Bengal. But for the thousands of ordinary Habshi soldiers and their families who had followed their leaders to this distant land, the victory cheers sounded like a death knell. They were no longer the kingmakers. They were the hunted. The land that had offered them a chance to rise from slavery to royalty had turned on them with unimaginable fury. The age of the African sultans of Bengal was over, ending in fire and ash, dramatic and violent chapter in the long, patient memory of the land. Thank you so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the hidden corners of history like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. See you next time. Victory, as history often reminds us, is a jealous master, demands not just the defeat of the enemy, but their erasure. With the fall of the tyrant Muzaffar Shah and the rise of the new Sultan Alauddin Hussein Shah, a dark decree was whispered through the marble halls of Gaur, decree that would seal the fate of the African Cup community in Bengal forever. The new Sultan was a visionary, a man who ushered in a cultural renaissance, but he was also a pragmatist. He looked at the thousands of Habshi soldiers, the Paiks who had served as the kingmakers for decades, and he saw a sword that had no handle. They were too powerful to be controlled, too dangerous to be trusted, and too foreign to be integrated. And so the order was given: expulsion. It is difficult to imagine the psychological collapse of a people who, just days before, were the masters of the empire. The Habshis were not merely dismissed from service. They were cast out. The gates of the city they had guarded, the palaces they had built, and the mosques where they had prayed were suddenly barred against them. Men who had stood at the right hand of the Sultan found themselves standing on the dusty road outside the city walls, stripping off their silks and donning the rough cloaks of the traveler. It was a second dislocation, a cruel echo of the original trauma that had brought them across the Indian Ocean. First, they were stolen from Africa. Now, they were banished from the land that had become their adopted home. The Exodus was biblical in its scale and tragedy. Historical records tell us that thousands of Abyssinian warriors, eunuchs, administrators, and their families began a long, sorrowful march westward. They left behind the lush, green delta of the Ganges, the land of rivers that had nourished their ambitions, and headed into the unknown. They were refugees of politics, carrying with them nothing but their weapons and their wounded pride. The local population, who had once feared them, now watched them go with a mixture of relief and pity. The dark cloud that had hung over Bengal was finally drifting away, pushed by the winds of a new dynasty. But this journey was not a march into oblivion. It was a march into a new identity. As they traversed the vast plains of northern India, moving towards the sultanates of Delhi and Gujarat, a transformation occurred. They were no longer the rulers of Bengal. They were becoming the Sidsis, a distinct martial caste, hardened by adversity and bound together by the struggle for survival. The road stripped away the softness of court life. The hunger, the heat, and the constant threat of bandits reawakened the dormant warrior spirit within them. They realized that while they had lost their throne, they had not lost their strength. Their bodies were still iron. Their will was still steel. He eventually found sanctuary in the rugged terrains of the Deccan and the coastal regions of Gujarat. Here, the local rulers did not see them as failed usurpers. They saw them as valuable mercenaries. The sultans of the Deccan, always locked in warfare with the Mughal Empire or each other, recognized the military value of these battle-hardened veterans from Bengal. The Habshis were hired not as slaves, but as elite professional soldiers. They were given forts to command and fleets to captain. The last exodus from Bengal was not the end of their story. It was merely a relocation of their stage. However, the psychological scar of the expulsion remained. In the evenings around the campfires in the rocky hills of the Deccan, the elders would tell stories of Gaurav, the golden mosque of the Firuz miner of the days when a black eunuch could look a king in the eye and not blink. These stories became the mythology of the Sidi community, a reminder of what was lost and a warning of the fickleness of power. They learned that land is temporary, titles are fleeting, but the brotherhood of the diaspora is the only fortress that cannot be breached. As the sun set on the 15th century, the Habshi presence in Bengal faded into a memory, a ghost story told to frighten children. But in the west, in the island fortress of Janjura and in the armies of Almanagar, they were rising again. They had survived the knife of the castrator, the intrigue of the harem, the madness of the tyrant, and the long, dusty road of exile. They were the survivors of history's shipwreck, battered but unbroken, proving once again that you can banish a man from a kingdom, but you cannot banish the kingliness from the man. The exodus was over, but the legacy of the African spirit in India was about to write its next enduring chapter. Stone is stubborn, but memory is fragile. If you walk through the ruins of Gaur today, on the border between India and Bangladesh, you will see the crumbling skeletons of a once great metropolis. The jungle has reclaimed the palaces where Barbak Shah once plotted in the dark. The moss covers the walls where the silent sentinels once stood guard. Yet, rising defiantly above the canopy is the Firuz miner, the tower of victory built by the noble Saifuddin Firuz Shah. It stands like a lighthouse in a sea of green, a solitary finger of masonry pointing towards the heavens. This tower is not merely a pile of bricks. It is the physical tombstone of the Habshi dynasty, a silent witness to a time when African kings ruled over the Bengal Delta. But the true legacy of the Habshi is not written in stone. It is written in the invisible ink of human possibility. The story of the Abyssinian eunuchs of Bengal is one of the most radical chapters in human history. In a world obsessed with lineage, caste, and biological wholeness, these men shattered every ceiling placed above them. They were the ultimate outsiders, racially distinct, religiously converted, and physically mutilated. Society told them they were tools, 9 men designed only to serve. Yet, they rejected this definition with a ferocity that still resonates across the centuries. It's proved that power does not reside in the bloodline of a father or the womb of a mother, God. It resides in the will of the individual. They took the trauma of the castration knife, the very thing meant to enslave the man, turned it into a weapon of liberation. By having no family, they made the state their family. By having no sons, they made history their heir. This period, often dismissed by colonial historians as a chaotic interregnum or a dark age of anarchy, was in fact a revolutionary experiment in meritocracy. For a brief, shining moment, the throne was not a birthright, but a prize for the most capable. Whether it was the ruthless ambition of Barbak Shah, the noble justice of Firuz Shah, or the tactical brilliance of Malik Andal, these men demonstrated the full spectrum of human potential. They showed that a former slave could be a tyrant, but he could also be a saint. They humanized the African experience in Asia, moving it beyond the one-dimensional caricature of the loyal servant to the complex, flawed and magnificent reality of the ruler. The exodus of the Habshis from Bengal did not end their influence. It merely dispersed it like seeds in the wind. The survivors who marched west into the Deccan carried with them the institutional memory of governance. They laid the groundwork for future legends like Malik Amber and Ahmed Nagar, the Ethiopian slave king who would later defy the mighty Mughal Empire for decades. The spirit of Galwar lived on in the forts of Janjira, in the hills of the Konkan coast. The Habshi rule in Bengal was the spark that lit a fire across the Indian subcontinent, proving that the African diaspora was not just a victim of history, but an active driving force within it. They were not flotsam on the tide of the Indian Ocean. They were the captains of the ship. As we look back at this saga through the lens of time, we must ask ourselves, what is a legacy? Is it a dynasty that lasts 1,000 years? Or is it the courage to stand up even for a single hour and say, I am here? The Habshi Sultans of Bengal remind us that the human spirit is indestructible. You can chain the body, you can steal the name, you can even cut away the flesh, but you cannot castrate the soul. Their reign was short, violent, and beautiful in its tragedy. They were the Castrated Guardians who survived the knife to seize the throne, a cave, and in doing so, they etched their names into the eternal roll of those who refused to be forgotten. They walked through the fire of slavery and emerged as kings. And though their empire has turned to dust, their story remains an immortal testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, the blackest coal can become a diamond under pressure. The echoes of the Durbar Hall have long since faded. The swords are rusted, and the silk robes have turned to dust. But if you listen closely to the winds blowing from the Bay of Bengal, past the Firuz Minor and through the ruins of Galwar, you can still hear them. You can hear the heavy footsteps of the silent sentinels. You can hear the whispers of the conspirators in the shadows. You can hear the command of the eunuch king. We hope this journey into the lost pages of history has ignited a fire in your mind. The story of the Habshi in Bengal is just one thread in the vast, vibrant tapestry of black history, a history that spans every continent and every ocean. It is a story that deserves to be told, not as a footnote, but as a headline. You were moved by the saga of the Castrated Guardians. If you believe that these stories must be preserved, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you view Malik Andal as a hero who saved the kingdom, or a traitor who turned on his brother? We want to hear your voice. Join us next time as we continue to unlock the archives of the forgotten, to shine a light on the unseen front lines, and to prove that history is never truly in the past. Until then, keep the history alive.